In addition to his own administration resisting his impulse to withdraw from Syria, Trump appears to have faced opposition from foreign allies. In addition to Netanyahu, the Saudi crown prince also expressed opposition to the ending of the war. Now I'm going to go to my next article on activistpost.com titled, Trump's Syria withdrawal was textbook U.S. deception. In the Iran deal, that's what this has all been about, is getting Iran out of the way. Trump isn't going to withdraw from Syria when the special interests he represents still fully plan on waging war, proxy or otherwise, on Syria's ally Iran, because Israel and the U.S. want to get that oil pipeline, which has to go through Syria up into Europe, up and running. But Iran and Russia have their own pipeline that they want to do, so you can see the conflict of interest there. The recent appointment of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo to key positions within his administration signal expanded war, not withdrawal. And if Trump was truly about if Trump was truly about get the U.S. out of the war with Syria, he wouldn't appoint John Bolton or Mike Pompeo to war hawks to his cabinet, because these men are only going to push for war, especially John Bolton, who's always been an Iran war hawk. The U.S. media is now priming the global public for U.S. intervention in Syria following alleged chemical attacks carried out in the remaining pocket of U.S.-backed militants in Douma, just northeast of Damascus. This following comments made by U.S. President Donald Trump just 3 days ago, in which he claimed he had instructed the U.S. military to prepare for a withdrawal from Syria, which brings me to Psalm 55 and 21. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter. The U.S. military will withdraw from Syria, but war was in his heart. As you'll come to see, now Trump is blaming Iran and Russia for backing the Assad regime in this chemical attack. His words were softer than oil. I'm a peace president. I think the U.S. shouldn't be intervening in countries abroad when we should worry about our country at home. Yet were they drawing swords. I've elected John Bolton, a major Iran war hawk, to plan for an eventual war with Iran after we withdraw from that Iranian nuclear deal. Let me see. U.S. forces had illegally invaded and have since occupied Syrian territory for years, with the Washington Post in its April 4, 2018 article titled, Trump Instructs Military to Begin Planning for Withdrawal from Syria, placing the current number of U.S. troops at approximately 2,000. The Washington Post also claimed that President Trump has instructed military leaders to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria as soon as possible and told them he wants Arab allies to take over and pay for stabilizing and reconstructing areas liberated from the Islamic State, according to senior U.S. officials. Again, the words of his mouth were smoother than butter. However, just days after Trump expressed a supposed desire to leave Syria, allegations of Syrian government chemical attacks on Douma have provided not only the perfect pretext to delay any withdrawal, but to in fact justify a U.S.-led military intervention directly against the Syrian government. But war was in his heart. While some have attempted to portray this as a Trump versus the deep state, it is in fact a textbook example of U.S. deception described in U.S. policy papers, a deception President Trump played a central role in creating. Feigning withdrawal before greater conflict is documented U.S. policy. In the 2009 Brookings Institute policy paper titled, Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran, everything from supporting terrorists in a proxy war, ISIS, to staged provocations and full-scale war were planned with it in excruciating detail. This is a pretty good document. Included among the U.S. policy think tank's schemes was the description of a deception similar to one now playing out in Syria. The paper would state, any military operation against Iran will likely be very unpopular around the world and require proper international context, but to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and minimize the blowback from it, The best way to minimize international opprobrium and maximize support, however grudgingly or covert, is to strike only when there is a widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer, one so good that only a regime determined to acquire nuclear weapons and acquire them for the wrong reasons would turn it down. Under those circumstances, the United States, or Israel, could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not in anger, and at least some in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it on themselves by refusing a very good deal. And as it says, under those circumstances, the United States or Israel, the least of the flock shall draw them out. For Syria, the offer was a U.S. withdrawal and Damascus and its neighbors given the responsibility to humanely end the conflict and stabilize the region. The rejection, inviting the U.S. to intervene, is the staged chemical attack in Douma the U.S. is now citing. Regarding the staged provocations, the Brookings paper mentions them as well, claiming it would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them. Clearly, the more outrageous and the more deadly and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to goad Iran into such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. And the whole world is already recognizing the games played by the U.S., such with these articles that are coming out and a bunch of whistleblowers. It's hard for the elites of Esau to use that left-hand energy to deceive the people anymore, though still you'll have a lot of people that'll fall for that propaganda and will gladly accept this possible new war in Syria. One method that would have some possibility of success would be to ratchet up covert regime change efforts in the hope that Tehran would retaliate overtly or even semi-overtly, which could then be portrayed as an unprovoked act of Iranian aggression. Nothing could be more outrageous or deadly than using chemical weapons on civilians. That such allegations of a chemical attack already served as a successful pretext for U.S. military aggression in the form of cruise missile strikes across Syria under President Trump before is precisely why the Syrian government wouldn't have carried out such chemical attacks then and most certainly would not carry them out now, especially if the U.S. was allegedly seeking to exit Syrian territory. Just to keep hammering in that point. His words were softer than oil will leave Syria to the Syrians and other Arabs, yet were they drawn swords. We must stay now because we can't allow these barbaric Assad regime to kill its own people with chemical weapons. Chemical weapons good for only one thing, a pretext for U.S. aggression. The Syrian military, with the support of Russia and Iran, have soundly defeated U.S.-backed militants across Syria with conventional weapons. The only significant territory Syria has yet to retake is that being occupied by the U.S. and NATO member Turkey, which isn't going to be an ally of the U.S. for too much longer. As it had been mentioned before, the extensive use of chemical weapons during the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq War by the U.S. military's own assessment proved such weapons to be highly ineffective and inferior to conventional weapons. Added to the fact that the U.S. has sought to use the deployment of chemical weapons as a pretext for direct military intervention in Syria toward long-sought after regime change in Damascus makes the likelihood that Damascus is using chemical weapons all the more impossible. There's also the fact that Syria has already turned its chemical weapons stockpiles over under a Russian brokered deal, which was overseen by the United Nations itself. Reading through the 2009 Brookings document, the U.S. has gone through all possible options preparing for Iran, but against Syria several times over, but to no avail. Even the prospect of balkanizing Syria appears tenuous. An attempt to revisit accusations of WMDs yet again signals desperation across Western policy circles. And what was the pretext for going to war with Iraq? Weapons of mass destruction. And also John Bolton was a part of Bush's cabinet back then, and he was a major he was a key player in pushing for a war with Iraq. It just you're seeing the same thing playing over again. For those who have invested hope in for those who have invested hope in President Trump, his role in a documented scheme to deceive the global public and make U.S. military aggression appear as a last resort after apparently withdrawing from confrontation is sufficient evidence that it is not Trump versus the deep state, but that Trump is the deep state. And you know we're going to go back to it again. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. It should be remembered that recent appointments to President Trump's administration included prominent pro-war advocates including John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, both eager for a U.S.-led military intervention in Iran, which makes President Trump's recent calls for a withdrawal from Syria all the more questionable.